If there's one topic that dominates the conversation surrounding Paper Mario, it's how the series has fallen from grace. The first two entries, the original and the Thousand-Year Door, are highly regarded examples of story-driven Mario games. Super Paper Mario is an experimental mixed bag, but generally well regarded. Sticker Star is an abomination of game design that makes fans' blood boil. But it's the last two entries, Color Splash and Origami King, that have cultivated a specific narrative surrounding the series' discourse. Nintendo is stubborn and refuses to make the Thousand-Year Door sequel that we want. This isn't a surprising development. Gamers can be very passionate, and passion often leads to irrational thinking. And I'm saying this because there's a far more complex explanation for why Nintendo quote-unquote ruined the series. That being a toxic combination of capitalism and artistic merit. You're just a filthy Nintendo apologist. At least hear me out before you type that in the comments. I'm using Paper Mario as the central example for this video because it's the most interesting one to choose, but the lesson can apply to lots of media. The lesson can apply to life in general as well. So buckle up, because you're getting a big fat dose of philosophy. First things first, let's run through the history of Paper Mario for those not in the know. Paper Mario started off as a sequel to the very first Mario RPG spin-off, Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. The first Paper Mario game was released on the Nintendo 64. All the fundamentals of reimagining the Mario world in an RPG setting from the previous game were carried over, but used to craft a new identity for the concept. Importantly, being in an RPG setting necessitated more story and character writing than what mainline Mario games typically bothered to include. Basically, any amount would have been more. But just as importantly, Paper Mario carried over from the previous game Nintendo's core design philosophy of accessibility. Many of the fundamentals of the RPG formula that go all the way back to its Dungeons & Dragons roots are simplified or even excluded from Mario RPGs. Things like equipment, stats, and class selection are nowhere near as complex in Mario RPGs as in more traditional ones. This is both a benefit to the series, but also an anchor, as I'll explain later. The next release was Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door for the GameCube. The basic formula of the first game was carried over and expanded in scope, delivering what longtime fans of the series consider the magnum opus of Mario RPGs. The third game, Super Paper Mario for the Wii, sits on its own little island between the classic beloved games and the controversial rest of the series. To directly quote the director, Ryota Kawade, "After we developed the previous game, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, I wanted to make a game that can surprise people with brand new features within the Paper Mario concept. Then, when I was drawing up some plans, I came up with an idea of switching between 2D and 3D. I felt that the more traditional Mario-style battles worked better in this game in order to effectively utilize this idea of dimension swapping, which is why we opted for this style. This will be important later. Paper Mario Sticker Star for the 3DS is where the controversy kicked into overdrive. It's impossible to have discussion of this game without getting an earful from hardcore, angry Paper Mario fans about how it's an affront to the series' identity. And it's not an unfounded stance to take issue with an RPG series that removes the two key aspects of an RPG, story and a leveling experience system. The following two games in the series, Color Splash for the Wii U and Origami King for the Switch, pulled back on some of these changes, doubled down on others, and added new things into the mix. But the end result was still dissatisfaction among the longtime series fans. People have tried to make sense of this change in direction for the series, primarily pinning the blame on Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, who's famous for preferring minimalism, especially in storytelling, and Kensuke Tanabe, a high-ranking producer at Nintendo who helmed the last few Paper Mario games. The Iwata Asks interview for Sticker Star is what people primarily cite as evidence for this, since there's a section where they talk about the game's prototype that, allegedly, was more in line with previous games. After E3, Miyamoto-san played the prototype and said it was just a port of the GameCube version. So we wondered what to do. Then the idea of using stickers came up. Originally, the plan was to use stickers here and there for solving puzzles on the overall map and so forth, but then we thought, if we're gonna do that, then we might as well use stickers for the whole thing, including battles, and we decided to begin rethinking the game mechanics. It's all too easy to interpret this as a blunder on the part of Miyamoto and Tanabe, and it wouldn't be wrong to say that with the context of the finished product. But the reality is that they were only following the same process as previous games in the series, and really following Nintendo philosophy itself. After we developed the previous game, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, I wanted to make a game that can surprise people with brand new features within the Paper Mario concept. Hell, Paper Mario itself stems from this philosophy. To recite a quote from earlier in the Sticker Star, Iwata asks, "After it was decided that Intelligent Systems would make a second Super Mario RPG, we ran into trouble deciding how it should look in order to bring out a different theme than in the main series. Speaking as a creative type myself, the absolute worst form of hell we could suffer is being forced to do the same thing repeatedly. And this philosophy stems from a simple fundamental principle of art. New is necessary for continuation. New in this case can mean a few different things. Iteration is simply casting the same formula in a new light. Evolution is taking the existing formula and building upon it. And revolution is adopting a completely new formula. And of course, new can be a mix of these things. However, this fundamental principle stands in stark opposition to the fundamentals of business. Success is necessary for continuation. And herein lies the issue at the heart of Paper Mario's controversial existence. Corporate Nintendo will follow the money to appease their shareholders, and anything with Mario slapped onto it is bound to make money, including Paper Mario, no matter what. But the Nintendo body of developers follow their artistic muse, which will always lead them down new, untrodden ground in everything they do. And this is where I'll iterate a point that all of us gamers should take to heart. Game developers are not wizards. If you're a passionate classic Paper Mario fan, you probably have an image in your head of an amazing new Paper Mario game that returns to the formula of the Thousand-Year Door. But belief and reality don't always align. That amazing new game might be out there, a little seedling within the mind of an aspiring dev who only needs to be given the keys to the franchise, but maybe not. And that uncertainty is why, from a purely artistic standpoint, I believe that the Paper Mario series should be laid to rest. And I stand by that conviction simply because I'm not a developer at Nintendo, and the actual developers at Nintendo clearly don't have any more ideas for how to iterate on the traditional Paper Mario formula. And it's not hard to see why if you look at the basic fundamentals of Mario and RPGs in general. The genre of RPGs draws a lot of its appeal from presenting new, interesting worlds, with new fleshed out characters from installment to installment. The Final Fantasy series is perhaps the greatest example of this. The sheer disparity between the early NES titles and where the series is at today is only possible because of how flexible the series can be by moving on to different worlds with different tones and themes with new installments. The complex equipment and class systems of RPGs also provides a degree of depth that makes it easier to iterate on existing formulas. Paper Mario is at a disadvantage in both of these aspects. Each new Paper Mario game might explore new, fantastical places, but they all need to feel in line with the world of Mario. And the cast of Mario is always going to take center stage, even with the existence of partners and other side characters, further limiting flexibility. And the Paper Mario series in general is very much designed to be baby's first RPG, lacking so much of the depth that other games can boast. Knowing all this, it's not hard to see why the developers might have struggled to adhere to the traditional Paper Mario formula when the series continued for long enough. Had the series ended with Super Paper Mario, I'm confident in saying we all would have been far happier. But that's not going to happen because, well, you know. But like I said at the beginning, there are countless examples of a series going on long past its expiration date. And obviously, that holds just as true in film as in games. You could probably name more film series that went on too long than you have fingers and toes to count them. Just throwing out some random examples off the top of my head: Land Before Time, Nightmare on Elm Street, Fast and Furious. But let's stick with games, since that's more interesting. I'm sure you could name more examples, but the two that immediately come to my mind are Dead Rising 4 and Metroid Prime 4. Two games that disappointed fans of their respective series, but with different reasons behind their problems. The developers of Dead Rising 2, 3, and 4, Capcom Vancouver, formerly Blue Castle Games, were so burnt out on the Dead Rising formula after 3 that they were eager to do something new. The initial proposal essentially would have reimagined Dead Rising in a vein more similar to The Last of Us, with a more serious tone and grounded physics. Capcom Japan was not pleased with the idea of turning Dead Rising into a completely different type of game, and eventually it was agreed to proceed forward with development sticking to the established formula. But Capcom Vancouver had to make the game utilizing only the money that had been initially allocated for the project, meaning various cuts had to be made to the established formula in order to stay within budget and deadline, turning out a subpar game in the end. The smarter course of action for Capcom to take in this situation would be to do what they did with Devil May Cry, which initially started off as a drastically different take on Resident Evil before Shinji Mikami, the shepherd of Resident Evil at the time, convinced them to make it a new IP. At least that way, a fully realized game could have been released at the end of development. And if it went over well with audiences, a new potential lucrative IP. In the case of Metroid Prime 4, Nintendo's hands were tied. Whatever their original vision of the game was at the start of development, and whether they truly believed they had a good team in place in Retro Studios' absence, and truly felt like the time was right to bring Metroid Prime back, they had a decision to make when things started going off the rails. They could do what they ultimately did, which was restart development from the ground up with a new team as they apparently believed was necessary, or they could cancel the game. In hindsight, canceling the game would have been the smarter choice, since the game hasn't been received well by fans, nor is there any indication it's been a commercial success. But the decision wasn't an easy one for Nintendo to make, I imagine. The game was announced during E3 2017, and the overwhelming positive reaction from fans would undoubtedly lead to a corresponding negative reaction if Nintendo went on camera and said they were canceling the game instead of announcing the game's restarted development when they did. But it's hard to believe that they couldn't foresee the problems that would arise from trying to restart development with Retro Studios, who, despite having developed the original Prime trilogy, had lost all the key staff that had made those games possible. Had they not announced the game's existence so early, they likely would have made the call to scrap development instead of restarting. Let's pretend for this next section that we live in a world where business has no power and artists have the autonomy to end their creations as they see fit. When is the time to throw in the towel and end a series? Well, the easiest method to follow is the trilogy. The basic story structure of a beginning setup, middle rising action, and ending climax applies well across 3 separate yet continuous stories. But some artists have grander ambitions than what can be contained within a single trilogy. In that case, it largely depends on the artist to have the good sense to understand when their story has nowhere left to go. But the medium of games is harder to pin down when the mechanical nature of gaming is more malleable than a medium which depends more so on story. Most series can squeeze out at least 2 entries through the development of their formulas. The initial entry lays the foundation, while the second game improves and builds upon it to deliver a better, more refined experience. Sometimes an experimental black sheep is thrown into the mix, either as the second or third entry. Many classic game series, such as Zelda, Castlevania, and Fire Emblem, had black sheep second entries. Paper Mario went from Foundation to improved version to experimental black sheep. But beyond this point, the potential for further entries is trickier to determine. A good rule of thumb to follow is that if advancements in technology aren't providing any new opportunities to iterate on a formula, then it's probably better to just end it. But the real determining factor as to a series' potential longevity comes down to its core essence and how generalist it is. The more specialized a formula is, the more restrictive and resistant to iteration it is. The essence of mainline Mario is platforming, pure and simple. Its basic malleability is great, to say nothing of what the advancement of console hardware has afforded the series, something that can't be said about Paper Mario. But at the end of the day, whether a series can successfully reinvent itself in the face of stagnation comes down to what the fans will accept. Of course, knowing when to quit while you're ahead is also just general good life advice. If you go to Vegas and hit the jackpot one time, it's not a hot take to say you're best off taking the money and running. The best advice to follow is, if you achieve a net positive result in whatever endeavor you're pursuing, don't push your luck any further. And to drive this point home, I'm going to break down 2 contrasting yet extraordinary examples from history. For this section, we're going back to the times of antiquity, specifically to the Mediterranean. In the late 4th century BC, the dominant power in the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world was the Kingdom of Macedon, and a constant threat to the peoples of both mainland Greece and Macedon was the Persian Empire to the east. And the king of Macedon was Alexander, who history would give the moniker of the Great. A tactical military genius, Alexander set out to accomplish what no one else in the ancient world could ever hope to, that being the conquest of the Persian Empire in its entirety. The story of Alexander the Great is worthy of his moniker, but his military genius is where his greatest triumph ultimately allowed the spirit of greed and ambition to consume him, because he would, in fact, conquer the Persian Empire by defeating its reigning king, Darius III, at the Battle of Gaugamela. Only with the support of the mighty Macedonian army could he accomplish this feat, and between conquering an entire empire and keeping mainland Greece under Macedonian subjugation, the soldiers were tired and homesick. But Alexander set his eyes next on India, and it eventually reached a tipping point. His army started to rebel, despite having led them to victory after victory, conquering so much of the known world. They wanted to go home. And in the end, Alexander the Great, one of history's greatest generals, was forced to quit and go home. But now we move forward about 500 years into the future, when Rome had conquered the entirety of the Mediterranean and Western Europe. The 3rd century AD is characterized within the Roman Empire as suffering from a period of military anarchy, where the army usurped control of the state and succession to the throne was effectively dictated by strength and conquest. This is known by history as the crisis of the 3rd century. The crisis ended in the year 284 with the ascension of Emperor Diocletian, who effectively saved the empire through a series of military and administrative reforms that changed the empire's structure for centuries afterward. Diocletian ruled for a little over 20 years before voluntarily abdicating, and this makes sense when you learn that Roman emperors getting assassinated was a common occurrence in the centuries preceding his ascension, and pretty much defined the crisis of the 3rd century. And yet, voluntary abdications pretty much never happened before Diocletian. Emperors either died of natural causes while in office, or were assassinated. The fact that he managed to rule for 20 years certainly speaks to his capabilities as a leader, enough that one might think he could continue going. But he knew when to stop pushing his luck, settling instead for leaving once he'd done everything he could to stabilize the empire. And this underscores the lesson of this video. It's a very human desire to want to replicate success, to keep pushing forward in a direction when going that way gives you a reward. But luck inevitably runs out if you keep rolling those dice without stopping. It's better to settle for a net positive than to keep pushing it until you eventually lose everything. But some people think they can replicate success forever by simply switching on to a different path. But not every new path leads to success. Sometimes it's a deep, treacherous trek through a dark swamp, and it doesn't matter if that journey is made for the sake of greed or artistic passion. Because as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.